I'm here today with Hyon Chu, and very excited to talk with him. I saw Hyun's video with Paul Vanderklay. I think I saw it yesterday. I don't know when it first came up, but Hyon apparently has gotten on the radar of our little corner of the universe via Twitter. And I find many of his ideas quite engaging, and I wanted to pick his brain a little bit about some of the things that we've been doing over here on my corner. And but I wanted to start first, Hyon, with, you mentioned on Paul's video that you were working on your second master's, which is in philosophy, which indicated that you had a first master's. And so I wondered what that was, and then tell me what it is, and then tell me enough about your life that would tell me how you happened to major in that.
So my first master's is actually an MBA, which I earned over in Boston. I got there in a very weird way. My bachelor's is actually in graphic design. So I somehow finagled that into a job working in structural engineering, structural and mechanical engineering. I was a consultant for the transway system here called BART. It's the intercity transway system. I did that for a few years. My coworkers, they were like, hey, you should really think about getting into engineering. And I was like, I don't want to do 100 units of math and just get another bachelor's again. And, but what we're doing here is we're developing products, and we're trying to figure out how those fit and how we can sell them. So I think the better move for me is to go get an MBA. And so I went to a small private business school called Babson in Boston. They're highly ranked for their entrepreneurship program, and that made sense in terms of product and thinking business-like and developing things for myself.
Okay, so somehow you went from an MBA into getting involved with AI.
Yeah, so that was weird because MBA was around 2011, and that was kind of at the tail end of the financial crisis. So I was just kind of figuring out, how do I break into industry? Especially because school is in the East Coast and I live here in the West Coast. So, most of the connections that are there don't actually work out here. So, one of the things I was like, okay, well, I'm here. I might as well learn how to get into code.
Can I ask something, Hyon?
Sure.
There's something squeaking in the background. Every time you move, there's something squeaking at.
I'm like probably
on
the microphone. I'm trying not to do that.
Okay.
So
it's distracting because we want to hear what you have to say. So, okay. So you wanted to learn to code.
Yeah, but I didn't want to be a software engineer. It just didn't sound fun. I hear horror stories of how people, check for hours for a little bit of a bug in their code, and it drives them nuts. And that just doesn't seem like what I want to do. So one of the things I actually wanted to do was getting into like algorithms. So, having gone to a program that focuses on entrepreneurship, I actually had a decent pitch idea, which was, how do I, Spotify and Netflix, they've come a long way, but the recommendations are still terrible, right? And so my idea was, how do I improve those? Not by, what those systems do is, they'll take the and they'll decompose it into factors. And what they'll do is, well, the songs you like have these factors. Here are some other songs that have the same factors. You'll probably like these. And that's just wrong. I don't like music because it sounds like other music necessarily, right? And so the idea was, well, I need to insert a human element to this. I have 2 or 3 friends that I can always trust for their music recommendations. And if I go, hey, what are you listening to? They'll give me 3, 4, 5 artists, and they'll be like, listen to these. And chances are I'll generally like those, right? It has nothing in common with what I've been listening to before. It's just this unknown, unmeasurable variable that exists between me and a very small circle. So the idea was, well, how do I make this circle larger? And so that wasn't really a software engineering problem. That was more like a data problem. Like, how do I encode information this way and that? I raised a little bit of money, had a couple of friends, volunteer to be the engineers and all that other stuff. But like, you can't ask your friends to be software engineers for you in Silicon Valley for too long for free, So, a lot of it was having to go learn to do it myself. And by the time that it was a 12-week program, it was one of those boot camps where I just learned as much as I could as fast as possible. And I came out the other end and I was like, I think the moment for this idea has passed. And so, I should start looking at industry. And I somehow just randomly got called by a company and they're like, hey, we're looking for people to work on our data insights initiatives. Do you want to come work for us? And that's how I got started.
You got into a company working on a data insights initiative from a boot camp? That's amazing. I mean, so you learned enough in a 12-week boot camp that you could actually be of considerable help to the company.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't, I mean, I did code, but it wasn't like, one of these software engineering jobs where I'm coding all day. A lot of it was just around, having an MBA helped because a lot of it was selling these things to businesses and looking at business use cases and saying, how can we do this? So if I was short on my coding skills, there was always people I can be like, okay, here's what I want to do. How do I get this done? And so it wasn't, it was there, but a lot of it was it's like research as well. So, it wasn't necessarily massively coding, but just trying to understand what's going on.
Yeah. So mostly what you learned from the coding was what could possibly be done if somebody knew enough to do it. I mean, you sort of began to understand the parameters of coding well enough to utilize the people around you in an effective way.
I mean, I did learn to code as well. But like, if you asked me to like code a whole like back-end system for like a banking thing, like I wouldn't know how to do it, but I did actually end up getting a patent for it. So, I think I'd submitted enough technically, but yeah, that's kind of the detail.
Wow, that's cool. So one of the things that caused a little consternation on your conversation with Paul was when you said that one of the things that you disagree with Jordan Peterson about is when he says, you know what I'm going to say here? When he says that meaning comes from pursuing an object. So I hear him in a completely different way. So I'd like to know where you got the idea that he ever said that. Because I mean, I've read pretty much everything he's ever written. And in my mind, he says a completely different thing, almost 180 opposite of that. So what did you interpret to mean that?
My understanding is that he says you will find meaning in a pursuit of a goal or something, right? And so
No,
maybe you disagree.
No. Yeah,
no.
That's not what he says.
Okay, then what does he say?
He says you find meaning by pursuing wisdom.
Right.
You pursue wisdom. So wisdom, and you and Paul were talking about this, that wisdom is intelligence guided by experience. And experience, of course, has two components. Well, it probably has 1,000 components, but I mean, we can think of the two big ones being the tradition and culture of the past, the accumulated experience that comes to us that we've learned, that we're nested inside of. And then there's the experience of moving forward into the unknown minute by minute and trying something. So you try, you fail, you learn something, you gain wisdom, you try, you succeed, you learn something, you gain wisdom. So it's in action that you begin to gain experience, and that experience helps you build your wisdom store. But it's when you're doing that, when you're having these experiences, that you begin to see the patterns, and it's the pattern that's the wisdom. Well, it's the pattern that's the meaning, the story, but you build your story out of, the way he puts it is, you put your focus on the highest good of which you can conceive.
Right.
And then that orients your perspective. And then within that perspective, the future sort of calls to you the things that you need to do in order to move forward towards that goal of serving the highest good of which you can conceive. And part of that is taking on the biggest responsibility, a bigger responsibility than you can currently manage.
But you just said that was a goal. The goal of the highest good.
Serving the highest good.
Yeah, but it's still a goal. And so what I kind of wanted to elaborate with my conversation with Paul is that you're talking about wisdom as doing and as being, right? But
Mhm.
it's very easy to, and I just learned this new word, it's called hypostatize, hypostatize or something like that. But it's basically to turn something that is like being and doing into an object or a thing. And so,
Well, okay, that's what they've made that word into. But hypostasis or hypostasis in the beginning is this idea, I think, and probably somebody will correct me and that'll be good. This idea that Jesus is both human and divine, right?
that's right. That's right. And so you have the divine, which is spirit, active, doing, and then you have the human, which can be reduced to an object. And so the concern wasn't, we're on the same wavelength, but I think I'm going that extra mile and saying you can turn any mode of being into an object and seek that mode of the objective mode as its own, seek it for its own sake. And so that becomes a form of idolatry. When it's objectified, when it's ensconced and becomes ossified, it's an object.
Okay, so I was thinking about that when you were talking to Paul about the marshmallow test.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one piece of that I couldn't quite understand how that could work. In the one case, they have the actual marshmallow there. I've heard about that story many times. And then when they get to where they can't stand it anymore, they eat the marshmallow. Yep. Or they don't. And if they don't, they get the money or whatever, or they get 2 marshmallows later on. Right. But if they're just conceiving of the marshmallow in their mind, how does the researcher know when they get to the place where they can't handle it anymore?
They're told at the beginning, you can call, we'll be in the room next to us and someone will have the marshmallow.
Ah, okay.
And so that gets into a different conversation about like, well, that child needs to trust that there actually is a marshmallow in the next room by a researcher.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, all of these things have a lot of tentacles, right? But the idea of the marshmallow being a real object and a virtual object or just an object in the child's mind got me to thinking about it. Would that be true for all objects, or was it specifically true in that instance because they were working with an object of desire, right? They're working with an object of temptation. What if it was some other object besides food, besides very tempting food?
Right. And so I don't remember the full name of the paper, but the research, the entire research around that whole marshmallow test is actually about attention. So it's really about how much attention before someone has to take action. The whole thing about delayed gratification has to come much later because it's only 20 years down the road that you can even verify that stuff. So it really is about attention. And so, if you pay attention to something long enough in a particular manner, it does become desire, but it also becomes something like worship or even just idolatry.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, in Psalm 115, it quite literally comes out and says that you become like what you look at. So it's talking about the carving of idols, but you will become like that because you're focused on that. And yeah, that's really interesting. So it was attentional focus that they were talking about. That, and I had never heard that. That is really interesting. And you're familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist? When he talks about the left hemisphere having the attentional focus, the grasping, the swooping in, seeing that particular thing, and then the right hemisphere having this kind of broader, more open, accepting knowledge from outside the self. So the marshmallow thing was working on left hemisphere engagement, probably.
I don't think they went that far to.
Well, they probably didn't. I mean, they wouldn't have.
It was like in the 60s, so yeah, that was a while ago.
Yeah.
But that's the whole. That's the empirical evidence that I'm trying to use to say, the thing out there in the external world, the thing inside your head or whatever, they have relatively equal valence, and that's becoming less distinguishable. And this leads into Owen Barfield, who talks about how language representation forces us to not see the world or reality as it is, because it's like an extra layer between us and the world, right?
Language is an extra layer between us and the world.
Yeah. So maybe this is kind of a tangent, but a lot of Barfield's work with linguistic people. He's Levi Brule as talking about people who are always in original participation.
I'm losing your, so I that whole last sentence didn't come through. So can you repeat
Sorry.
it?
Owen Barfield's work is about language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how language becomes so representational that it is that we confuse language for actual things. And so that's the same parallel track that we're discussing earlier about the thought of the marshmallow versus the actual marshmallow. So language now. So
which book of his are you referring to when you?
This is Saving the Appearances.
Oh, from Saving the Appearances. Okay.
But also a lot of Vincent Diffus's book as well, where he compares Heidegger and Barfield in opposition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't run into that particular. Michael Vincent Diffus was actually on the channel maybe 6 months ago talking about it. I don't recall him talking about that particular thing, but I didn't read the book. I didn't read his book. But when I'm thinking about language, Michael and I have been doing a series on Barfield's book, The Speaker's Meaning, and which is a very short book. It's only got 4 chapters. We've only been through 3 chapters of those. So I haven't read chapter 4 yet. So there's probably something there I've got to get. But in there, one of the intriguing things that he talked about in terms of language was the breakdown between accuracy and expression. And of course, it maps onto a lot of other things, but broadly speaking, accuracy is this attentional focus, very pointed, focused thing. And expression is the meaning that comes more out of, well, Vervaeke talks about relevance realization, which I think is, a lot of people say that the thing that I call experiential DNA is actually Vervaeke's relevance realization. But we each have, you were talking earlier about the inside and the outside and how that's one of the problems with AI. We each have this internal world that is composed from the very beginning of our lives, from the people that we know and the experiences that we have and the songs that we hear and the books that we read. And every time we have a debate in our heads between 2 ideas, and all of those things wire up everything about us and to kind of create this, I don't have a good word for it, but it's kind of like a matrix or a hypergraph inside of us that's waiting for new things to come in and attach. And those new things come in and attach to this whole thing that we have. That's what makes each individual so idiosyncratic, right?
Right. Well,
and I don't know what to call that thing, but
I think we can have it. So language has made a tremendous impact on how we, how we interact with the world. You mentioned that, there's this hypergraph inside of us that interacts with the external.
Mm-hmm.
Pre-linguistically, it was all self-contained. There was no one to correct us about our thoughts being wrong or anything like that, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that I would call something like ontology, or like a foundational ontology, because it's only I'm instantiating it. It's instantiated only as I actively do it. I'm the one that populates it, and I'm the only one that can make any changes to it. So, if we consider that ontological, then we have something like the opposite, which is epistemological, which is information and knowledge encroaching or joining our ontology.
Mm-hmm.
But, I guess idolatry is when epistemology enters your ontology and overrides what's ontologically true, right? So it's knowledge overriding being, and in a lot of different ways, it's harming being, because there's just so much information and a lot of info hazards, and we don't know how much of it's good or bad anymore. So now we just kind of let epistemology have free reign on our ontology.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you were talking on Paul's conversation about how everybody wants to be my epistemic they want to be my epistemology. They want to tell me what to think, right? Or
That's right.
The marketers want to tell you what to feel and what to think and how to react. And all Twitter wants to tell you how to see the world, and the politicians want to tell you how to think. And yeah, everyone's trying to get from the outside to come in. And Peterson's gotten into a little bit of trouble. Well, I mean, he's always getting into trouble, but for a long time, he's been on this kick about how ideology basically narrows your world to this point. I would use Vervaeke's terminology, reciprocal narrowing, because you get trapped inside of a certain way of thinking that doesn't have any of these little feelers out anymore. There's nothing of you left in it. It's just some other box of thinking that somebody has put together, and then you've adopted it. And so he put on his Twitter feed the other day just a meme that says abandon ideology, and a whole bunch of people jumped on, absolutely completely misunderstanding what he was saying and flipping it upside down 180 degrees. And I mean, to me, it's so obvious what he's saying when he says abandon ideology, because it was something I had done a couple of years before I ran into him. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have even listened to him if I hadn't abandoned ideology. So, and it made a huge difference in my life, because when I got all twisted up in all this political stuff, and you just kind of go down this same rat hole day after day after day. You're so concerned with every bit of news and every little thing that happens, and it just eats up the inside of you, because there's no room for the ontology anymore. Exactly like you said, it just comes in and tries to override. It's overwriting, right? It's like a computer. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. The way I've been thinking about this is that, I think you really pointed out when I was talking about an object-oriented existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we can say an object-oriented existence, and the objects are language and knowledge. And so what's happening is that the agent comports him or herself to the object. And so the way the ontology learns how to update itself becomes actually dictated by the knowledge coming in and the epistemology coming in. And so the agent is less free in their way to broaden their relationships to the world, or how they think about everything, because the patterns of epistemology start overriding the patterns of their ontology.
Mm-hmm.
And not just the patterns, but maybe the frequency, not the frequency, but like the broadness or the narrowness of the relationships between the points of knowledge. Maybe they get smaller, or maybe it was one of desire, but it gets written over by one of something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so the more that's imposed on us, the more, because we're extractors, we compress things and we extract them, because we just can't understand the whole world. What we do is we extract and compress all the ideas that are coming in, and that becomes the structures that we impose on our representations and what we know, and that actually does start changing how we perceive.
Mm-hmm. Well, you might be interested in the work of Esther Meek, M-E-E-K, because she proposes that the solution to this is what she calls it covenantal epistemology, but I would call it an epistemology of love. And the general idea is, she takes this from Michael Polanyi, and the other name, Bernard Lonergan. Yeah. And the way that she explains it is that true knowing comes from having a loving relationship with the thing to be known. So if you think about riding a bicycle, or taking care of a rose bush, or any of these things that require an embodied procedural kind of knowing, there is this, they use this terminology, subsidiary focal integration. So I can't really explain right now what that whole thing is, because it's just very much on the periphery of my intellect right now. But the idea is that if you say you want to learn how to prune a rose tree, a rose bush, you have to get to know the needs of that rose bush. You have to understand how that rose bush grows and what's going to make it flourish and what's going to make it healthier in the future and what might damage it. And it's by that whole process that as you're learning about this rose bush, you're developing a relationship with the rose bush. As you learn to ride a bicycle, you're developing a relationship with the bicycle. The same kind of thing happens even when you are, I think about it like when Jordan Peterson talks about the threshold of the moving from now into the next moment. When you're confronted by this field of infinite possibility, and you don't know how to make your way through the field of infinite possibility. So the way that you see a potential path is by putting your gaze on the highest good of which you can conceive. And then that orients the path for you. And there's a little glimmer out in front of you, calling you forward onto that path. And as you go, there might be anomalies that come up that you stumble over or that create chaos or whatever. Each one of those is an experience. But if you trust that being is good, then you can continue moving through towards that object that's glimmering out in the future, which it'll keep changing position because our aim is not perfect and our walking towards the aim is not perfect, but you have to have a trust. You have to have a trusting relationship that moving forward is a good thing, that being is good. You have to have that. And so that rests at the center of all knowing. And that goes together with McGilchrist's idea that as the right hemisphere is the hemisphere that engages with the knowledge that is available, brings it in, hands it to the left hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere does all their magic with it. But McGilchrist says that what's happening right now, because of the tech world and all that kind of stuff, is that we've gotten all up in the left hemisphere and we're not re-engaging with the right hemisphere. So we're missing that, what Esther Meek would call that loving relationship with the world, basically, with the goodness of being. That the goodness of being is always offering us something new to know. But you have to look at knowing as a slightly different thing than the way we think of knowing now. You know, it's not intellectual knowing. It's what expands us. Knowledge is what grows us, right?
Not necessarily. And so I think so you mentioned like 3-4 different people there, and they all have a slightly different variation of what everything means. But you know, when you were talking about Jordan Peterson, you said keep your eyes on a goal, on an object, and your relationship will, based on that object, will flourish or develop in such a way. And so that.
But I don't see how you can think of God as an object. That's the part I don't understand. If it's just an object in the world, yes, of course that could be ideology. But if it's the highest good, if it's the highest unity and the highest good, how can that be an object? That's the part I don't get.
But that's the whole incarnation is to conceive of God as an object, isn't it? That's the whole point of God taking on flesh, is he became a person, an object in the world, when traditionally he is something outside of his own creation.
Well, so maybe I need to clarify what you're thinking of there. So when you think of the incarnation, are you thinking of that as an ultimate good, or are you thinking of that as an idolatry?
No, idolatry is when we ensconce being into an object, whether it's a mental object or a physical object. And so to think of Christ as man in a cloak with a beard, that will be flirting with idolatry. But when we think of Christ as someone who so loved the world that he did all the things he did and suffered the way he did, that's more of thinking him as a mode, isn't it?
Well, no, I mean, it depends on what you think of the scriptures, because the scripture says that he came in the flesh, and that that's one of the things that is important for us to trust, that as a truth, that there is a good to the material world. I mean, if you start thinking that the only good is in the immaterial world, then you're flirting with Gnosticism, right?
No, it's not that there's only good in the non-material world. It's just idolatry is when we do that metaphysical sleight of hand of saying spirit, of mistaking spirit for matter.
Well, in my mind, idolatry is when we put anything else in the place of the ultimate good, in the place of God, in the place of being himself, the ultimate good.
Yeah, I'm using more of a Barfieldian. Let me try to get the quote for you now, but
I think what you might be thinking about with Barfield is the distinction between an idol and an icon.
no.
Oh.
Idolatry is thus a collective state of mind which perceives all things and no images. It is the effective tendency to abstract the sense content from the whole representation and seek that for its own sake. So sense content, we're talking about physical objects, but also mental representations.
Like propositional, like you're talking about propositional truths.
No, not necessarily. Because, you know, if it's all ontological, if it's all me without language, then there is no such thing as propositional truth, right? And so for me to, without language, mistake the golden calf for God, that's me mistaking the sense content for the goodness of being or the ultimate being as such. And so it's a reduction. And so that's what idolatry is for Barfield. It's just this constant reduction into an objective, a target, a goal, you know, a word like wisdom or things like that. And forgetting all the processes that an agent has in achieving that end, right? So when Jesus made, he fed, was it 5,000 with fish and loaves? The fish don't matter, the loaves don't matter. What matters is what happened in between the objects, right? And that's not a sense content thing. That's just something that we, as intelligent creatures, have come to learn to abstract or correlate, or however you want to call that.
What matters is what happened in between the fishes and the loaves.
Yeah, it's kind of a difficult thing, but let's just say I desire something, right? That desire is independent of me and the object, right? And so we can abstract desire, but it is not an object. So what is that abstraction that can independently exist? It's not sense content, but it is a mode of being or doing. Does that make sense?
No, well, I mean, now you're saying being or doing as though they're equivalent. So that confuses me a little bit, because before you were talking about being and doing as being in opposition to each other.
It depends on the context that I'm addressing, right? But I mean, let's go back to your graph example, right? Like you were talking about hypergraphs. You know, X is connected to Y with an edge, right? So X and Y are independent of the edge, right? So if we call the edge desire, X is me and Y is the object, those three entities can exist independent of each other, right? And so we can extract the edge as itself and say that's desire, that's love, that's a mode, that is a being. Whereas the X or Y are the things. And so
so that's the whole mapping. See, that when Peterson is talking about, when he maps order and chaos, and then the edge between order and chaos is, you could look at it many different ways. One is it's the updating principle. The other is that it's the hero who goes over into the chaos and gathers there the treasures that can be brought back to update the order. He also maps that onto the known and the unknown, with the knower being the edge in between. And interestingly enough, when he does that mapping, he calls the known the spirit, and the knower, the known is the spirit, and the unknown, okay, I just lost that mapping. We were just talking about it the other day. But anyway, the idea is that there's this edge between.
Yes.
And that edge between is really where everything resides. That's
Right.
where being resides. That's where reality resides. That edge, it maps onto reality.
Yep.
That edge maps onto
Yep.
truth.
Yep.
So truth and reality are this, and being are the same thing. And in my mind, that is Christ. And not the sandals and the robe and the long hair, but that reality that he's, in fact, I have this little clip. Let me play this for you because I think you might find this interesting. Have you ever heard of the Cataclysm sentence?
No.
This is pretty cool. Apparently, in some sort of lecture in 1961, Richard Feynman was at Caltech and he was talking to his students, and he said, if in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence was passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? So he had asked his students this, and the students talked about it. And now we never get the answer to what happened in that classroom, but Bishop Barron had prepared some responses to this. He was asked this in his, what is it, Word on Fire podcast. And so he thought about it. He had thought about it ahead of time. And so he thought, okay, if it were Moses giving the cataclysm sentence, it would be Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one.
Yeah.
And what Bishop Barron said about that was that to be pluralistic at the level of highest value is diabolic. That was really interesting. Rather, we need clarity regarding the unity of the highest value, which, I mean, that goes right alongside what Jordan Peterson is always saying. Focus on the highest good of which you can conceive, right? And then he went on to say, Jesus' cataclysm sentence would be, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that is because Jesus is the pattern by which all of reality is properly viewed. He is the pattern by which all things are known. He is the pattern of patterns. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus is the Logos of the Creator God, and what is revealed in him should also be on display in the material world. So, reactions?
I'm still trying to process it.
Well, maybe we could start with, what would your cataclysm sentence be?
Oh man, that's even tougher.
It's a good one to think about though, right? Did you ever read the a Canticle for Leibowitz?
No.
It's a fictional book, maybe written 50 years ago, I don't know. But it's about a time in the dystopian future when everything was destroyed. I mean, some major cataclysm destroyed just about everything on Earth, but there were a few pockets of people left, and the book starts out at a little kind of deserty place where some little group of monks has survived. They're not really monks. I mean, because they're trying to recreate something from something that they heard someplace. And so they're trying to kind of make a new world, but they find this box, and in this box, there is a tiny piece of technology that wasn't destroyed because it was hidden away. And they're trying to figure out what to make of it, but they're not pre-linguistic, but they're certainly pre-technology, pre-industrial, everything, and trying to make some sense of this piece of technology. So that technology is kind of like the data compression of the Cataclysm sentence. And it's the only thing that's left. So yeah, it's a very interesting book.
What do they do with it?
Well, I'm not going to tell you.
Fair enough.
They try to build it, but you know, what would you do if you were pre-industrial and you're trying, if you found some piece of code, what would you do with it? You know,
Yeah.
in a future world, which brings me to, anyway, you can keep processing that thing. You can go back and watch the clip sometime again. If you ever watch this video again, you'll have a chance to run by it one more time. But to me, that I totally agree with what Bishop Barron was saying there in terms of who Christ is. And so the other one I wanted to show you is, well, first of all, we talked about the Stephen Wolfram theory of everything, where he says that there's just that a simple rule can create the universe. That's the basic idea that's underlying it.
Mhm.
And there was a section in this conversation that I had with Michael, who is way more technical than I am. And Michael just had a few questions, and I'll run these by you since you've worked in the tech world. If you have a rule, the thing that Wolfram never talks about is this: what does it run on? You know, and what constrains the rule and what powers the rule into reality? What is the enforcement law that gets it to follow the rule? And does it need an error correction mechanism? Because those are all things that Wolfram never really talks about. But the things that he does talk about are super interesting, because one of the things he talks about is that, well, here, let me play this very short clip again for you that you can see. He talks about computational irreducibility.
Oh, he doesn't conceptualize information in that way.
Yes.
But it's this other worldly thing that somehow is able to order and structure what we see.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. And I just found it really interesting, because it's so, man, it's so opposite to what other people have been going down. And one of the ideas that I found the most interesting in his talk track is, I don't know if this popped out to you or not, but this idea of computational irreducibility.
Yep, I've got that highlighted. I've got it text quoted here. I can bring it up if you want.
Yeah, if you have a quote on it that you could read, it'd probably be better than me trying to summarize it poorly.
Yep, here it is right here. Computational irreducibility. Even though you know the underlying rule, it may be difficult to predict what it's going to do for the system itself. It just follows the rule, applying it, many, many times and getting to the results here. But the question is, can we jump ahead? Can we reduce the computational work that is needed to figure out the answer? The answer is there are many of these systems where that is not possible, where you are stuck with computational irreducibility. It's a kind of wall closely related to undecidability and Gödel's theorem and things like that. It's a wall where jump ahead predictive science doesn't work. I thought we would be mired in this from the beginning, but it turns out there's a kind of layer of reducibility on top of a sort of underlying computational irreducibility in these models. And that layer of reducibility turns out to map almost perfectly to what we already know in physics. I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
So, because if the whole structure of the universe was mired in computational irreducibility, we'd never be able to know anything. We wouldn't be able to have any scientific discovery or make any progress at all.
Yeah.
But just by happenstance, there's a layer of computational reducibility that runs right through the system.
Yeah.
It's so perfect, and he can't see it. So anyway, that's the gift of the layer of computational reducibility, which he says is exactly lines up with the laws of physics. So, I mean, that's what makes Wolfram so interesting, is that he says these things. I mean, presuming that he's got some foundation, you know, he's got some structure underneath it. He's got a lot of people working for him, and they're coming up with stuff. Now, I'm not saying that the world is created out of this simple rule that Wolfram is talking about, but I think they're very interesting ideas. Because why is physics so effective? Why is mathematics so effective? Why is it that we can describe the world using these fairly simple formulas? You know, it's a very interesting thing.
Yeah, I'm no expert in mathematics, but you know, one of the things that shows up a lot is the three-body problem. You know, trying to calculate the movement of three bodies, we just can't do it. And so, what that seems to tell me is that there's a lot of stuff out there that we just kind of can't explain for. We can say physics works and mathematics works for a lot of different things, but you know, mathematics contradicts itself all the time as well. And you know, like entire systems are thrown because it doesn't fit the existing paradigm. But you know, I think at a more meta human level, you know, I think the insistence in materialism or physicalism or you know the scientific vision is that humans are Turing complete, or you know, humans can be solved with sufficient objective equations. But you know, I think my project is to just say, like, you know, that is conditioned on the humans. Physics requires itself to not contradict itself to be held up, but human nature is naturally contradictory. So how do you insert contradictory statements into a system that requires non-contradiction? And I think that's kind of where I'm more interested in, and that is where human agency and you know and things like that come in.
Well, when you were talking, Paul, you were mentioning that. Well, first of all, you were saying that one of the things that AI can't get is it doesn't have this understanding of the inside and the outside. And then you were also saying that one of the places that you see a place for us to be distinctly human is in this edge between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. So would you like to expand on that a little bit more?
So there's GPT-4 out, and it crunched a massive amount of text. And people say that it can write poetry, but it doesn't even know how to rhyme words, which is like a fundamental thing of poetry, I feel like. And so, you know, it's missing something there. What is there? What is that thing that it's missing? And, you know, what that thing is going to be different for everyone because of our psychological backgrounds, our physiological backgrounds, you know, our attentional attitudes at any given moment. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to encapsulate humanity by statistical, what I've been calling univocity. The most statistical outcome is the real outcome or the expected outcome. Therefore, it is the outcome that should be represented, and that's wrong. It doesn't account for a lot of people, at the far ends of the distribution, and it always tries to. At the end of the day, it tries to calculate humanity. If you put all the calculations together, it tries to ensconce humanity into one answer or one output. And we can do that, but it doesn't seem like we can do that with humans. And so why is it that we cannot do that? And that's kind of where I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm. When you were just talking about that, all of a sudden what came in my mind is they're always trying to do that with the bell curve, as though each person's bell curve all lines up at the same place. So if you're average in, I don't know, if you have an average running speed, are you also average in your ability to read books? Are you also average in your ability to do art? They act as though all these averages pile up together, and then all the people who are average are just average. But really, some people are average in one thing and excel in another, and then they might be really bad at something else. And they all pile up in different places. So, the distribution isn't at all what they think it is. There might be a big pile in the middle of a certain thing, but any individual could be anywhere along that line at any given moment in their life, depending on what parameter you're talking about, what variables you're talking about.
Yeah, and if you cross multiply all those together, you basically just have one standard human, which is probably incompatible with any human ever that has ever lived. And so it's like saying humans only have one meaning, and here's the meaning, here's what it means to be human, and that just seems wrong to me. And that's kind of, yeah.
And what happens with AI if one of the things that makes certain humans excessively creative in some area, like let's take Einstein, he's always a good example. Maybe part of what makes him in that area something is that in another area he's very weak. Maybe he had problems with social interaction, who knows what that was, or maybe he had difficulties understanding poetry. I don't know. He was a human being. He probably had weaknesses, but those weaknesses were probably part of at least what catapulted him to be able to make the leaps that he made in the area where he was strong.
Well, I think that's kind of, the statement you just made, there's a fundamental underlying claim that we can turn all of our features into better, worse, 0.09, 0.05, whatever. Right?
Yeah.
And so to go back to my earlier point, I think that's what I mean by idolatry, is that we think we could objectify these facets, and by objectifying a large enough number of them that we can actually replicate the human experience, and that doesn't cash out for me.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. That it totally, when the left brain thinking takes over and you start getting statistical and all. Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, because what looks like a weakness to one person looks like a strength to another person. And in reality, even in my own life, what looks like a weakness to me it's like a piece of paper where one side of it is the weakness and the other side is the strength, and they're one thing. You can't separate the two.
But even to go a step further, for anyone to say that is strong or weak is kind of a reduction of being, right? And that's what I mean by objects and objectives versus being.
Well, okay, but if you go down that road completely, don't you put yourself in danger of falling into the postmodern pit? I mean, this is the thing I'm always kind of struggling with, because on the one hand, I can see how all of that stuff is possible. And then on the other hand, I think, well, one of the debates that Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke were having was around the idea of Philia Sophia and Philia Nikeia, the love of wisdom or the love of victory. And they're having this discussion about, that one or the other must be the better one. But in reality, you need both. You need to have a sense that that victory can also be good, because the possibility of victory is part of what drives us to move forward, is part of what drives us to achieve, to gain strength. And so if you don't have, and this is one of the things Peterson talks about, is that if you don't have some sense of value of one thing being better than another, you'd never move. You would just sit and you'd never get off of this moment now. You have to have that's a better or that's worse. That's what helps us to, and I had a long conversation with Mark Solms, who wrote the book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. There was a lot of things I didn't agree with him about, but he was explaining the brainstem as the part of our system that has in it this kind of value modulator, hungry, not hungry, hot, cold. And that's the motivation for action. So if at the very brainstem, our motivation for action is a value structure, then we can't say there is no good and no bad, right?
Well, postmodernism is like what I was talking about with AI, right? Like it's, where do you get values? Because it's the most popular one and that most people have. So that's essentially what AI is trying to do by trying to calculate statistics and saying this is the most frequent thing and therefore it is the truth.
That's how you would interpret postmodernism?
How else would you ascertain any truth in postmodernism?
I mean, you're saying that the only place that they can find truth is the only place where they look for truth is in polling.
Yeah, it's an agreement, right? Like this word means this because that's what we use it for now, and that is the popular usage. So it's a statistical univocity, right? We agree statistically, therefore it is the truth. And so
because they gave up on categories, they gave up on having a common understanding of things.
Yeah, the latter more than the former. And so the solution to that would be something like a religion, because then that gives you that, rather than polling to get what is true, at least there's some grounding that is outside the purview of the people that are in it that says this is our common guiding star or north star or something, right? And people reject that because they'll say something like, well, why should I listen to you? Because the alternative is you're just going to have to make up your own star all the time. And that becomes very difficult to do.
Well, and you were telling Paul that one of the reasons that we can't design our own values is that it's computationally irreducible. We can't see where it's going to go. We can't see the ultimate end of our value decisions. If we're making up our own values, we have no idea what the final consequence is going to be. That's
right. And have you heard of Laplace's demon? Yeah, and so I kind of have a corollary to that and say, let's say it is possible to have all the data of all the atoms and all their potentials in the universe. Like, that's fine, but we still don't know what algorithm we would use to figure out what would happen in the next minute or second or anything, right? And so that's one of the arguments I would use to say, it's not deep learning, it's not neural networks, it's not any of the stuff that we have right now. And that's one of the arguments I use against artificial intelligence.
Well, one of the things that's kind of interesting about Wolfram's theory of everything is that he talks about I don't know right where the clip is right now, but I'll try to reframe it. He talks about how, you know, it starts with the very simple rule, and then as the rule continues to update, that complexity grows, and that once you have enough complexity out there, one of the things he's finding is that at any given node in the network, at that point, there may be other rules available for update, but it can choose any rule it wants to update at that point. And if there were two particles in the same spot and one particle chose rule A and the other particle chose rule B, eventually they're going to end up in the same place anyway.
How does that work?
Right?
Well,
I mean, Tim, if that's true, I'll find the clip and send it to you, because when he explains it, obviously makes more sense than when I explain it. But if that's true, what that means is that we could have complete freedom of choice and still rest in the very comforting truth that when we make a mistake or we mess up or we fall into chaos or terrible things happen to us, if we put that into God's hands, then he will make something good out of it. So we have a choice, we have freedom to move forward with our own free will. And even when we make mistakes, there is a way back to the ultimate good.
But I don't think Wolfram takes that into consideration when he's talking about
it. Of course not. Of course not. He's not thinking about those things at all. He's just talking about a rule that updates iteratively. That's all.
But it's happening in a vacuum, right? And that's what's really confusing me right now.
Well, part of what he's discovering as he goes on, because he's been at this for, he's been actively working at it with his Wolfram project for several years, probably. And I've been watching ever since he started because I was fascinated by it. But one of the things he's found is he's found a different paradigm for what space is and for what time is. And so he actually does see this thing moving through space, but that space is, I'm going to say this wrong, I know, and I shouldn't even try, but something like points in time. So that at any given point in time, at any given moment, there are all these points of space. So when you look at his, you know, you see the branching going out and going out. The universe is growing as the rule iterates. And if you cut a slice through that, then there's all these points at various places, right?
Sure.
So you have a slice with all these points. Those points are where, those are the nodes, but they're existing in a substrate of space at that moment in time. So space is almost like if you could take slices through his hypergraph, and at each slice, those nodes are going to be in a different place because it's a different point in time. But that slice, that whole big disc or whatever it is, it's like a silicon wafer, is a substrate of points in space. I'm not describing it properly, but
well, I'm thinking that he's not thinking of. So let's just take that same example and apply it to evolution, right? Evolution, the belief is that we started from very few creatures and now we've adapted to this multitude of array of creatures from like a giant tree. If he's trying to say both of those converge at the same point, you know, there's probably a lot of examples of divergent animals who look the same and have very similar things, but they don't converge at the exact same point, right? And so that's a big difference between converging near each other, but also converging exactly at the same thing. And that's because there's evolutionary forces always on it. And so for So I think it sounds like in Wolfram's system, he doesn't really have any evolutionary pressures or any other pressures. He's just kind of letting the numbers run and saying, oh, look, at this point, these two numbers converge at the same number. Well, yeah, that makes sense. But again, that's the whole univocity, equivocity thing, right? Like if it's univocal, of course, the numbers play out as such that they meet at the same point, because that's just, you run a calculation for an infinite amount of time, and that's just going to happen. But what's happening is that we don't really notice that happening in terms of life or intelligent or conscious things. And so,
well, and part of it is time though, right? Because if this action that's going on with his universe is computationally irreducible, you don't know where it's going. You don't have a jump ahead predictive science, he says, to know where it's going to be at some point in the future. You just have to let the program run. They've been letting the program run for 3 years. But before evolution even started, the program was running for 14 billion years or something.
yeah.
Right. So if it's computationally irreducible, I mean, yeah, I'm just saying, in his mind, this is where he may be thinking that if it's computationally irreducible, you won't get to the place where you can even think about creatures or evolution of even the simplest, like even the simplest cell. I was reading the other day, took 200 scientists 20 years or something like that to parse out every part of one simple cell, because there's so much complexity in a single cell, even the simplest cell. So before you get to that point where there's even a cell, where there's even a first life. Oh, and here's a question for you, a philosophical question. If you think about first life, there's no life, there's only chemistry, there's no biology yet, okay? There's only chemistry. And then there's life. We don't know what that life looks like. Is it a cell or what? It has to be reproducible, and right, and it has to have some sort of a boundary, otherwise it wouldn't exist, right? It wouldn't be a thing. So they're always saying, Richard Dawkins always talks about the selfish gene wanting to reproduce and keep the species alive and everything. Go back to the very first life. Why did it want to stay alive? I mean, the first life has no sentience. It doesn't know it's alive and think, oh, wow, life is great, I want to keep doing this. What gave first life the motive action to want to stay alive, to move forward, to even move? What gave it the motive action to even move?
Yeah, I don't know if philosophy can answer that question, right?
Because of Gödel's theorem, right? There's always the inside and the outside.
Well, I mean, the theory I'm developing is essentially along those lines, but I'm using evolution as the foil, right? Like, I don't know what the very first creature looks like, but what I do know is that there are creatures that, to be evolutionarily successful, must need an outside, right? Otherwise, it doesn't know how to reproduce. It doesn't know how to, know when it's approaching food. And so that's kind of where I'm building this idea about relationships, because, the very first intelligent creature, let's just say, all the other ones that did not have this notion of inside and outside were destroyed by evolution, right? Because they just can't replicate. And so the very first intelligent creature knew the inside and outside, but also knew that there was some relationship across inside and outside, right? And that cannot be depicted by the notion of inside or outside. So it's metaphysically and logically different than the inside and outside, right? And so now, returning to Wolfram's idea, if we just let those things run by themselves, the representations get more complex, and the relationships between the representations also get more complex, right? And so now you have this creature constantly taking in data, and making representations of what its external universe is. So you have this arms race of creatures saying, well, if I make a more sophisticated representation, then I'm going to out-survive you, right? And so that seems to cause this further arms reaction of like, well, if I make a more accurate representation, I'll be better survival. But at the same time, I'm running out of brain space. So what I need now is like some sort of compression algorithm that compresses the representation in a very accurate manner. So now you have evolution forming that system to compress representations. But, and that gets further and further and further to the point where
but you're giving you're giving a lot of agency to the organism then, right?
That's right. And I'm saying that capacity to impose a relationship between inside and outside, that is fundamental agency. And so now for me to impose a different relationship, say one of desire to another person, that is the most fundamental form of agency. And so now it's this, so now we get into the whole object subject thing, right? Like if my capacity as an agent is to impose a relationship from myself to an object, if the object dictates the rules of what I'm imposing, then I lose agency, which is a weird thing to do.
If the object does what now?
So I can impose a relationship to an object as a subject, right? And so if I'm so object oriented that the relationship I impose becomes reduced by an object, then I'm less of an agent. Because of my greed, I lose, or like
it's addiction. I mean, that's addiction basically.
Yeah. And so the drug makes me less of an agent, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's what Vervaeke calls reciprocal narrowing. You eventually narrow down so much there's nothing left of you but the drug.
Yes, but that's not metaphysically true, right? Like you can't say there's nothing left of you except the drug, mm-hmm. because you're still there as an agent. And so, what I would ask in a conversation with John Vervaeke is, how much of that is me and how much of that is the object? It's clear that the agent doesn't have agency. The agent, the object, the drug does not have any intelligence. So whatever relationship is happening is all from me, right? It's a unidirectional thing no matter what. So how is it that we can be reduced in that capacity by something that has no intelligence and has no agency?
Well, I guess it depends on what you think of. This is a little woo, but Jonathan Peugeot and Paul van der Klee are always talking about this meaning of the word spirit, thinking of like Paul talks about the idea of school spirit. Right? You've heard him talk about school spirit. It's a thing. Or when people talk about conspiracies, it's not that a bunch of people are getting together in a room and planning and plotting something and keeping secrets. It's that there is a spirit in the environment that is navigating towards a certain goal, and not a spirit in the sense of red tails and horns. That's not what I mean, but there's just a spirit. There's an I guess Jung would call it the animus or the anime, the
animating spirit.
Yeah, there's an animating spirit that's out there. And so maybe in the once you build that relationship with the object, where you give up control of your agency to the object, that there actually gets to be an animating spirit in between the object and the subject. Basically, you're giving up control. You're subordinating yourself to this object, right?
That's right. And so I think Gilbert Ryle used the example as well. He talks about a foreign visitor comes to university. They show him the school and the grounds and the students, and at the end of the thing, he goes, "Well, where's the university?" Right? And so so this is, I think, what I was talking about earlier about not ensconcing the spirit as an object. Like to ensconce it and say the university is the buildings and the quad and the students, that's wrong. That's what I would say is parallel to idolatry. And
or to call, when you're talking about the church, to call it the building, or to call it the hierarchy, or to call it the institution or the administration, rather than seeing the church as the body of relationships amongst all of the believers, right?
But you can't know the relationships without the actual physical manifestations happening, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what makes it easy for someone to mistake spirit for the physical objects, because you need the physical objects to extract the spirit, but how you extract the spirit to the individual. And so whatever relationships they're imposing is their agency. And so in that agency, it is also how they're also intelligent. Right? Because what you see as the school spirit and what I see as school spirit, we'll both agree nominally that it's school spirit, but what's going on inside your head, inside your ontology that you created of it, is going to be severely different from mine.
Right.
And so what we do is we make a word and we say spirit, and then that's kind of what Barfield is saying about idolatry, is that's
Barfield's thing about speaker's meaning. There's the semantic meaning, and then there's the speaker's meaning, and the speaker's meaning is that thing that's inside our ontology, right? That's
right. And so I think the current the US argument about free speech, I think that's what's happening. I think we're the thing about free speech is that the speaker should be able to free what they want to say. But there's the second portion where the hearer should be able to interpret however they deem fit, right? But what's happening is that if you think about slurs, what's happening is that slurs can only come to mean one thing, and it's always the negative thing. And so it becomes objective in its meaning, but people use that as a weapon to, tear down other people, right? A lot of words that are considered slurs now are medical terms, but they've commandeered the meaning. They've commandeered speaker's meaning to the extent that, a word like autist is an insult and only can be understood as an insult. And so now I think a lot of polite society has just become this like giant language game, and we have like language policing and all the players. And so what's happening is because of what Barfield considers idolatry in ensconcing language into objective meaning, what you have now is like the postmodernist doing that to a lot of words and literature, literary texts, and saying this is the only meaning that can be derived from this, and this is how society comports itself around this meaning. And so now that's what I think a lot of the culture wars are about.
If we could go back just a second to when you were talking about life and the inside and the outside, and your project regarding using evolution as part of your frame for your idea. A couple of things I wanted to mention to you is we've done a lot of work over on this channel about boundaries, because boundaries is one of these fundamental things about the whole universe. It turns out to be very, very important. And a lot of what I came to think about boundaries came out of my understanding of how they work in art. And there's many different levels in art regarding boundaries, both the boundaries that you impose on yourself in order to do the art, and the boundaries that you use on the substrate to create the image. And one of the things that when you're creating the image, one of the things about the boundary that's very, very important is that that there's a place to move through. There always has to be like a semi-permeable. You don't want to stop the eye. Like when you're doing graphic design or you're doing posters, you might be using very hard lines, right? You might outline everything with nice dark black lines and everything. And there's a nice look to that. I like that. But when you're trying to create a place for the viewer to interact with your work, you need to leave space for them to interact. And part of that, so for the viewer to gain a relationship with the work that will grow over time, requires these porous boundaries, these edges that let you see what you're going to see there, not just what the artist is trying to impose on the work. So anyway, I have a lot of videos where we talk about that. And The other thing that I wanted to mention is when you were talking about, I can't remember what you were, the particular point, but I wrote this down because I think you may already have heard of Karl Friston.
Nope.
Okay, so you want to look at the work of Karl Friston, especially in the area of Markov's blanket. Because Markov's blanket is the way that the inside and the outside of our sense making and our sensory apparatus and our active apparatus, and the way that they interact with each other through the brain. And so Markov's blanket, well, it's too much to talk about right now because we've been going for an hour and a half already, but you want to look it up. There's some very good videos, Karl Friston and Markov's blanket. I think he's a good teacher. He's very concise, and you could probably find a half-hour video that would tell you everything you needed to know. I might even find one and put it in the description.
Right.
But it will be very helpful for your project, I think.
Do you know
when
if
you think about the inside outside?
Do you know if Markov's blanket and Markov's chain share the same Markov?
Might be. Markov's blanket is the center of the nodes.
Yeah, that's
each
probably
have an influence on the next two, and then so it's sort of like a parent unit, and then the children, and then the grandchildren, and who influences what. But there's certain places where it can't come back again. It can only go out. So the active nodes can only go out, and then the sensing nodes come in. And anyway, it creates this thing. And he has some nice illustrations about it.
I have
It's
to
a
look
good
that
way
up.
to talk about the inside and outside.
Yeah. Cool.
This has been really fun. I don't know if you want to talk again, but it would be fun to grapple with some of these things in the future.
I think so too. Yeah. So let's put something on the calendar for that.
Okay. Sounds
Cool.
great. Thank you, Hyon.
All right. Thank you. Good
Bye-bye.
talking to you. Bye-bye.